theories. We've had, Charlie said some good stuff about what's going on in his church. But now what I want to do is I want to talk basically, and for those of you on Zoom, this is some steps we call strategic envisioning, some steps that I recommend that all churches go through. Even if the church is healthy, what we've discovered is that every 3 years our culture is changing. Years ago, our culture would stay the same for decades, but now our culture is changing every 3 years. My suspicion is it's going to even be shorter than that. My suspicion is it's going to change every 1 to 2 years now. It's that quick. And so what happens with the church is that the church doesn't keep up with the changes of our culture. And by not keeping up, so to speak, we lose ground on trying to be healthy as a church. So that's what I want to talk about, is strategic envisioning. Remember I said there were some critical questions that we needed to ask. The first question is, why do we exist? Now usually in this session it's very interactive. I get the feeling I'm not going to get a lot of interaction, so especially from those of you on Zoom. So I'm just going to go ahead and answer the questions for you. How's that? All right. Seeing that I know it all, right, Charlie? All right. So why do we exist? Okay, that's a simple answer. And the simple answer we talked about yesterday is we exist, first of all, to glorify God, right? But we also exist to make disciples, to baptize them, all right, to preach the gospel, all of that, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. That's why we exist. Everything else is gravy. So we need to get that back. So I think that one of the things that churches need to do is get back to the very basic of why we exist. During COVID, we stripped everything because we could only do one basic thing. And I think our churches have become way overloaded with too much activity, and we lost the reason why we even exist. And I know some of you are saying, oh no, we exist because of men's fellowship, but we exist. No, we exist because God calls us to preach the gospel. We exist because God calls us to reach the world with the good news of Jesus Christ. We exist to glorify God. Simple as that. Secondly, how do we behave? We talked about core values yesterday. Spent a lot of time on core values. And I'll talk about that a little bit more today. Then thirdly, what do we do? When we talked about what churches normally do. So now I'm going to talk about what do we do as far as, what do we do with the information we got this weekend? What do we do with that? So, and then the next question, and the final question is, how can we get healthy? What steps can we take to get healthy as a church again? Is it God's will that every church be healthy? I believe it is. I honestly believe it is. And I think if anybody messed it up, we did. So first of all, we need to start making decisions that are intentional, that are purposeful, and that aligns with the core values of our church and allows us to maximize our assets. And we're going to talk about assets in a few minutes. One of the problems, I think, again, is that our core values are unspoken core values. Churches have very few aspirational core values, and they have very few permission-giving core values, but there's a lot of unspoken core values in the church. Okay, so when I ask a church what they think would help them grow, you know what they'll tell me? Anybody want to take a guess? More people, specifically what type of people? Young people. So what are we going to do? We're going to hire a youth pastor. And she or he better be the best. The problem is we don't have a youth culture anymore like we used to have. So yesterday I met with one of my former students who's actually a youth pastor in his dad's church. And he said to me, I don't have a youth group anymore. What I have is I have youth that are willing to come every now and then and be discipled and be mentored. But the idea of having a rah-rah youth group anymore, they don't exist. And yet many of us are in nostalgia days when we remember, I was a youth pastor for a while, 10 years ago. I was a youth pastor for a while, okay? Steve Bills was a youth pastor for a while. I really wanted to bring a picture of him as a youth pastor, but I forgot to do it. But anyways, and youth groups were a lot of fun. We had this thing called ranch when I was going to Bible college, and I had a ranch. Now, that doesn't mean I had a ranch, but it was called, the youth group was called Ranch. And my youth group, my ranch, would attract 80 to 90 kids on a Tuesday night to sing really stupid songs like Do Lord and Give Me Oil in My Lamp. Remember those songs? It only takes a spark to set a fire going. You know, all those wonderful songs. All right. Those were the contemporary songs then. All right. And we would serve tube steaks. You know, anybody know what tube steaks are? Hot dogs. See, bug juice, right? And those types of things were fun, and the youth got into it. And in our youth group, the one that I was leading, we attracted football players, cheerleaders. We attracted the up and up of this school in Miami. And then I'd have a Bible study on Friday mornings or Friday during lunch in the courtyard, because it was in Florida, the courtyard of the school, and have between 30 and 40 kids who would take their lunches and sit for a Bible study. That is non-existent today. It just doesn't happen. Even Young Life right now is struggling to try to get kids to go to their Young Life clubs. So we need to rethink what it means to have youth in the church. And hiring the best youth pastor is not going to work anymore. And that's, remember I said yesterday, we have to stop thinking in the past and need to think about today. So we need to start making decisions that will work for our church, that are purposeful, and understand what are our assets. And I'll talk to you in a few minutes about how we can do that. So that's the most important thing. Secondly, I think what's really important for us as a church, especially now post-COVID, is that we need to make a list of essential and non-essential actions or activities. I think a lot of churches have a lot of activities that they just need to stop doing. And what's happening is that our younger people, if they're going to attend our church, they don't have the time that is needed to really function in a lot of our churches. So in the church where I just retired from, most of my leaders were people who commuted to Boston. We were an hour from Boston without traffic. So that means if they wanted to get to Boston by 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock, they needed to leave at 6 o'clock in the morning because there's traffic that time, all right? So they left at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning to go to work in Boston, and then it takes them that long to get back home. So they're going to get back home at 7 o'clock. It's dinner time. The kids want to see their dad or their mom. How excited do you think they would be in coming to an evening activity at the church? Didn't happen. Didn't happen. And so we ended up, even our board of elders, that was our board, even our board of elders had to meet Sunday after church. Because that was the only time that we had some free time. Even though I was exhausted from preaching, that was the only time that we were able to meet. That was the only board we had, and we didn't have any committees. And you know what? We grew as a church. Without committees, I know this is shocking. Without trustees, without deacons and deaconesses, and we grew. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. So we need to decide, especially now post-COVID, we need to decide what can we do in the church and do well. And then strip everything else. And that is a hard process. Because Charlie mentioned there's ownership. And we have to realize there shouldn't be ownership in the church. Now, I joked around with the guy that I met with yesterday, and he has a little baby girl, and he just loves his little baby girl. And while we were having coffee at Starbucks, he was holding her, and he says, "Oh, it's just so good to hold my child." I says, "Yep, and at 18 years old, you have to stop holding her, and you have to let her go, so that she can be the person that God wants her to be." Sometimes in the church, we have to stop holding that which we find so precious and let it go. It doesn't belong to us anyways. And so one of the things I tell churches to do is, what are those things that you can let go of? And what is the one thing that you can do really, really, really well? And that's your asset. That's what you need to focus on. But you also have to open your minds up to new possibilities, whatever those are. I don't know this area well, so I can't tell you what the possibilities are here, but I'm sure there are many. You have to open your mind up to something that doesn't necessarily fit in the DNA of the church, because that's an opening door. That's an open door for you, possibly. And I told you, if we look at this formula of belong, believe, and behave, it can get pretty messy. Are we willing to be a little messy for God? So, having a planning process is as important to the congregation's future as an architectural plan is for building a house or a building. And guess what? It's biblical. One of my favorite passages that I use in my leadership class is from Exodus 18, where Jethro goes to Moses and says, "Let me tell you something, Moses. If you don't stop what you're doing and get some help, you're going to burn out." And unfortunately, what the church has done over the years, especially if it's a Christendom church, is that they depend on the pastor to do everything. She is going to burn out if she has to do everything. We really need to understand that God never intended the pastor to do everything. As a matter of fact, there was an issue in the book of Acts. The apostles were so busy praying and studying their Bibles that the deacons came, well, not they weren't deacons, but people came up to the apostles and said, "Listen, guys, you're not doing your job very well. There are some starving widows out there. How come you're not out there taking care of the widows?" And so the apostles prayed about it, and they went back to their board and said, "We need to spend more time in prayer and Bible study, so let's pick some men and women to do that work of feeding the widows." Boy, if a pastor went to the board and he said to the board, "You know, I am spending so much time doing all this stuff, I really need to spend more time in prayer and Bible study," he would probably get fired. What do you mean? Why can't you have tea with Mary? Why can't you go golfing with Joe and lead him to Jesus? Why can't you do all these things? You have to think about that. Another one that I like is from 1 Chronicles 12:32. It said, "The man of Issachar thought strategically," here it is, "for they understood their times and knew what Israel should do." What a great verse. Because I'm afraid a lot of our churches really don't understand the time that we live in. I got to tell you, I teach millennials. I'm 71 years old. Tuesday I will be. And I teach millennials. They drive me crazy because they think differently. They act differently. They are really weird. But that's the new generation. And I'm actually finding also, but I'm enjoying being with them. They're really stretching me as an individual. But that's the times we live in. They're also very inconsistent. And they'll have a standard here that makes a lot of sense, and then they'll have a standard here that makes no sense at all based on that standard there. They think very differently. And so a lot of us really need to learn. Okay, let me back up. Right now in the Church of Jesus Christ, there are 5 distinct generations. It's never happened this way before. There's the builder generation, and a lot of those, I hate to say it, have one foot on the banana peel and the other foot in the grave. But it's true. They're dying out. God's taking them home. I try not to say that too harshly. I'm going to be next. Then there's the boomer generation. That's my generation. We think differently than our parents did. See, before my generation, if you had kids, your kids pretty well stayed at home, lived in the community that you lived in, and pretty well did the same thing mom and dad did. Then my generation came along and we started acting differently. Then my kids' generations came along and they acted differently than me. And go on. 5 distinct generations, and every one of them are different. And somehow we have to find commonality in the body of Christ. And that's why a lot of our churches have mostly builder generation. Maybe with a few baby boomers. That's about it. And the reason behind that, I think, is they really haven't understood the culture that the church is in, and the community, and what's happening in the community. So, and when you think about it, all of Paul's missionary journeys were strategically planned. So to me, strategically planning is really important. So what is the process? Okay, this is the process. And that is this. We need to assist the church to develop the capacity to see things, to weigh in on things, to listen. Wow, that's a hard one. And discover the highest aspirations and the deepest values, as well as acknowledge its limits and understanding its true identity. So what I am convinced that one of the things we need to do is stop thinking of this building as being the only place that God's at work. If you took this building and you turned it around, what would it look like? I'm going to let you interact. If you turn this building, turn it around, and it goes like this, what does it look like? A boat, an ark. And when Noah went into the ark, why did he go in there? To evangelize? Why did he go in the ark? For safety. Away from the world. All right? Well, in many ways, that's how we see our church. We feel very comfortable and safe in our building. God never intended the church to be that way. I think the biggest mistake we made was build buildings. I really do. They're costing us a fortune for the 30 or 40 people that actually show up in church. So we need to really think through, and this is what, as an executive in my region, this is what I do. I help churches until they ask me not to come anymore. I ask churches to discover their identity, their true identity, and help the churches understand the culture that we live in. And I suspect that the culture of the West Coast is no different than the East Coast. We're just smarter on the East Coast. Hey, we got Harvard. I know you got this thing called Stanford down in California, but you know, we have Harvard, we have MIT. I mean, we're good. All right. So, how do you do this? First of all, you develop a strategic leadership team. Now, in some churches, that just means the remnant. I have to be honest, okay? Who should be on that team? Key players. Now, these are not necessarily people on the board, but this is Mary down the street that every time Mary speaks, everybody listens to Mary. These are key players. Every church has them. Her name was Lorna in my last church. And I decided, keep your enemies close, right? Keep your friends close, keep your enemies really close. So she became my closest ally. I'll tell you a story about her in a second. But anyways, but when she spoke, 84-year-old lady, when she spoke, everybody listened to Lorna. Now they would say, oh, well, that's Lorna, but they listened to her. So she was a key player in our church. Then influencers. These are the quiet people in the community. They don't say much. But if you go up to them and if you talk to them just a little bit, oh, they're very opinionated. But you would think their sweet Joe comes to church on Sunday, never says a word. And then, of course, the leaders, the board members, whatever you have as a leadership. And then innovators. Is there anybody in your church that understands diversity and can be a cross-representative between one generation and another? Now, some churches can't put this together. So my suggestion always is get the key people who are willing to be stretched, the key people who are really looking at this as a serious issue and saying, what can we do? And sometimes what you need to do is realize that you have this beautiful, huge building, and it's not being used the way it should be used. Maybe we need to think about who we are and what needs to happen here. In some cases, like in Charlie's cases, he took a church that basically was down to X number of people. They turned the building over, turned the assets over, and Charlie did a wonderful job in planting a new church, but still taking care of the key players of the church. We've done that several times in some of our older churches in New Hampshire, Vermont. Massachusetts, I'm having a hard time convincing them, but we'll get there. The other thing we have is we have a lot of part-time churches. A lot of churches have gone to the point where they are part-time pastors. And I have two churches that are 5 miles apart from each other. I can't get them to do anything together. You know why? They each have their own cemetery. So dead people are stopping these churches from moving together. Can you believe it? But it's true. We're in New England. We're a little different there. All right. Here are some people not to invite. This sounds terrible, but it's true. It really sounds like, oh, Pastor, where's your empathy? I don't have any. So I can say this, all right? Somebody who has empathy will say, oh, how can you say this? Okay. Anyways, here's people not to invite. Indecisive people. Well, Pastor, that's a good idea, but those people, I can't handle them, all right? Indecisive people. Secondly, people pleasers. This is a hard one. A lot of people are people pleasers. And you can figure out I'm not. But my wife is a people pleaser. And she'll say to me, do you realize what you said today? Yeah. And she goes, do you realize how many people you hurt? Remember I asked you to forgive me at the very beginning of this? And I said, no. Well, you hurt so-and-so and you hurt. I'm sorry. Because what happens with people pleasing is that we have a hard time making decisions because we want everybody to like us. And if you want everybody to like us, you're not going to be able to make the tough decisions. And don't invite opponents to people who don't like the pastor. Because the first thing they're going to say is what? Get me a new pastor and our church will grow. I've heard this over and over and over again, and that's not the case at all. Sometimes he or she is the right pastor. It's just that the people are the wrong people. And yeah, that's provocative, Steve, right. And people who move too quickly to make decisions, because again, remember, when you make a change, there is a grief process. Please understand this, that as you as a church decide to make a significant change, please understand that there are people who will be grieving over that change. I've never known anybody to grieve over the fact of pulling the pews out and putting chairs in. I think that the reason why we had pews is because they tried to keep people awake. You know what they used to do years ago in the Puritan church? In the Puritan church, not only did you have pews that were very uncomfortable, but the ushers or the deacons would have this stick with a metal ball, a wooden ball on one end, and a feather on the other. And if Ev would fall asleep, they would go and tickle him, and if he didn't wake up, they'd hit him over the head. I'm serious. Boy, we ought to do that more in the church. All right? But anyways, people who make decisions too quickly, we need to be careful about them because we need to understand that people need time to grieve the process. And don't invite people who are unwilling to change themselves. Now, how many of you didn't change it? And you please be interactive here so I don't feel like I'm talking to the wall. How many of you didn't make any changes at all during COVID? Raise your hand. Every one of you had to go through changes. And guess what? You're still alive. You survived. You might have even learned something. All right? So don't tell me you can't make changes. I was sharing with somebody the other day, my mom's 94 years old. The woman's so healthy. She's also can be a pain, but that's another issue. She probably thinks the same thing about me. But I was talking to my mom, and when I was down there in November, she lives in Florida, and I said, Mom, what changes have you experienced in your life? And she started listing all the changes. And then I said, which ones were good? She goes, all of them. It's made life a lot easier. She goes, can you imagine? She goes, at 94 years old, I can use a microwave. She goes, I don't think I've used my stove in months. And I'm going, whoa, you know? And she goes, and this cell phone, it's great, except I can't hear anything, but it's great. So we had to get her a phone that types things out. Anyways, what I'm saying is that we have all experienced changes and we have survived them. Why can't the church be the same way? And then the next one is a little bit people with an agenda. So years ago, I interviewed in a church, because I get kicked out of churches every now and then. I interviewed in this church, and it was a really strange church. And so I preached, and actually I was candidating to be the pastor of the church. And I preached, and after the sermon, I would say 7 or 8 people came up and asked me questions because I knew right away these were agendas. It was many, many years ago, and so, of course, one of the ladies came up and said, well, what do you think about women in leadership? Somebody came up and said, what do you think about raising hands in church? Somebody came up and said, what do you think about a tuba in church? You know, all these questions, and I'm thinking to myself, yeah, there's a lot of agendas in this church that they haven't worked through yet. As a matter of fact, it was so bad that when I met with the search committee, they fought right in front of me. And my wife and I left, and they didn't even know we left because they were so intent in fighting with each other. Oh, yeah, I want to go to that church. But so we have to be careful about people who have an agenda, okay? So, what do we do now? So we have this group of people, maybe it's the remnant, or we have this group of people, and so we need to do an assessment. We talked about the core values yesterday, and again, it's really important for you to talk about core values. What really are the core values of your church? What is the DNA of your church? What are those core values that you are willing to give up for the sake of growth or for the sake of turning your building over or whatever God tells you to do? All right? Then you have to, who are the people who attend? What do we have left? I hate to say that, but it's true. What do we have left? And then we need to create a membership or profile. And I agree with Charlie. I hate the word member. We didn't use the word member. We took that out years ago. And we called ourselves covenant partners. So we are partners in ministry. So if you become a covenant partner, what you're saying is you're willing to step up to the next level and be partner in doing the work of ministry. Membership had all sorts of ramifications to it. And there are some now there's some legal ramifications to membership. So for instance, if a church doesn't have in their bylaws Matthew 18, which is the whole thing about disciplining, and we kick somebody out of the church for whatever reason we kicked them out of the church, if we don't have the process written in the bylaws, you know you can be sued? They can actually sue the church. So we took membership out. Just, it's gone. And then we changed it to covenant partners, and it's worked really well. So, but for most churches, you have members or participants. Who's attending your church right now? Make a list of what generation they belong to. Who's attending your church? Then identify in your church the gifts and the competency of your church. Let me explain. Some people in your church are incredibly gifted to do one or two things. List who those people are and what they can possibly do, and how competent are they in using their gifts. I'm not talking about spiritual gifts here necessarily, although that can be included. But more, what are they skilled to do? How can they help you move? What are they skilled to do? Identify people's core gifts and competency. And then look at your attendance and your finances, which is kind of depressing. But you have to look at that seriously. All right, what else can you do? Where has the church been? This is important. So part of assessment, I think, is for people to talk about the history of the church. And the reason why we need to talk about the history of the church is that we're going to learn by talking about the history, not nostalgia now, but talking about the history, we're going to learn the curves, and I'll show you this in a second, the life cycle curves, and where we might have went wrong. All of our churches have had a rich history. All of our churches have. But we don't talk about it. Because when you start talking about it, you're going to go, uh-oh, what did we do wrong? Where did we go wrong? Some churches have had splits over some of the stupidest things. Baptists are known. Do you know how many Baptist denominations there are? 600 and some odd Baptist denominations. There's a Baptist denomination that split over another Baptist denomination because they decided that God said that the only way to be immersed is 3 times forward. Okay, they're called primitive Baptists. I mean, we split over the lousiest thing. And so, but part of our history may be to talk about those splits. So in the church I just left, they had 3 splits. The first split was over the charismatic movement. Go figure. All right? There was a group of people who liked to raise their hands. There was a group of people who didn't want to raise their hands because they were Baptists. And so they split, and like of the world down the street, we unintentionally planted that church. And then there was a split over the version of the Bible. The pastor wanted to use one version, and the other group wanted to use the King James Version. So they left, and they planted a church about a mile away from our church. And then the third split was over our denominational affiliation. So we planted unintentionally 3 churches. But the problem with that is those 3 events created a lot of pain within families, in the community, and with our children. And so we went through the process of getting together with each of those churches, their leadership, and talking about it and praying about it, forgiving one another and releasing each other to do what God wants us to do. That was huge. In one of my churches, when I became the pastor, I was doing everything right. I think I was doing everything right, and we weren't growing. We just weren't growing. And so one day we were talking about the history of the church, and what I found out is 5 years ago, 5 years before I got there was a black church that wanted to meet in our church. And the leadership of the church said no. They were uncomfortable with a black church meeting in their lily white church. Man, that just threw me for a loop. It was another American Baptist church. And so I went to that black pastor, and he and I became friends. And I said to him, you need to come to our church. I want you to preach. I want your choir to sing, and we're going to sit there and soak it up. And so they came. 8 people left our church that day. And I couldn't thank God more. And after that event, we tripled in size within a year. Sometimes there's sin that we have to deal with. Sometimes there's sin that we have to deal with. So that's why talking about our history is so important, because we really need to find out what we've been doing and have we been doing it right or wrong. Secondly, in the years of the church history, talk about the activities of church. Talk about stats of the church. Talk about, again, it's all about the history. And then in the past year to the present, start looking at your programs, and again, and what are you feeling are your primary activities. So let me talk about this real quick. Every church and every organization has what we call a life cycle. Okay, so every church was once a plant. Did you know that? Every church was planted once. And when you're planted as a church, when you start a church, it's exciting. You're seeing all these people come. You're feeling just the excitement of it, what it means to be a church, and you start experiencing growth. People are coming. People are getting excited. And then all of a sudden you get to the point where you're stable. And here's the problem. We like being stable, don't we? But the problem with stability is death. It's the problem with it. If you talk to any business, they will tell you that when they get to that top of stability, they need to rethink what they're doing and how they're doing it. So in New England, we have a lot of examples. How many of you remember let me change that. How many of you remember Polaroid? Everybody had to have a Polaroid camera because it took instant pictures, right? Well, Polaroid was this very huge business in Massachusetts. But they never changed. They always thought that there would always be a need for Polaroid. They had no idea that digital would come along. iPhones would come along. What happened to that company? Because they didn't reinvent themselves. What's there now is a shopping center. There was another company called Digital. Some of you remember the old dot matrix printer. Remember that? You know, it makes so much noise. You know, Everybody thought, oh, wow, this is really, really cool. And the digital thought, there'll never be anything better than this. And then IBM came along with what's called a laser printer. And digital said, well, they're too expensive. They had all these excuses why they didn't want to change. And what happened? 28,000 people were let go in one day. And they closed the doors. My point is this, that in the point of stability, when we think we have it all together, we're already towards death. And that's where we have to redefine who we are, restudy the culture, restudy the community, and say, what do we need to do to get back to growth? But the problem is, we didn't do it, and so we started going on decline and decline and decline, and now many of our churches are either one of two things. They're either in the stage where they really need to redevelop and rethink who they are as a church, or they need to allow a new church to come in and do a rebirth. I hate that last option, by the way. I really do, but it's necessary in a lot of our churches. And then, of course, there's death. If you don't want to do anything, okay. Then when God takes you home, we'll have a beautiful building and nobody in it. All right. Here's another assessment tool that I'm going to give you. And this is called SWOT. It doesn't mean SWAT each other, okay? But SWOT. And it's called strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's really a great tool to use as you evaluate and assess your church. Now, here's the problem. When I ask a church what their strength is, what do you think the number one thing they're going to tell me? We're friendly. We're loving. Really? I'm not sure about the loving part. I'm not even sure about the friendly part. But they'll always say that. Every church thinks they are the most loving church. Every church would think they're the most friendliest church. And so I won't argue with them, all right? We went to one church to visit when we were between churches, and I had heard good things about this church. And so my wife and my three kids, and my two kids, we drive up to this church, and there was a special spot for visitors, which I thought was really cool then, all right? Don't suggest it anymore, but anyways, then. And then there was a red carpet from that visitor parking area into this very special entrance that was decorated with flowers. It was beautiful. I'm like, wow, we're really going to be greeted. We're going to feel really, really loved here. We walked through that special entranceway, and when we got into the church building, not one person said hi to us. But they're the friendliest church in town. Okay? So we really need to think through what our strengths really, really are. Oh, by the way, your pastor is one of the strengths. Yeah, pull that one out because if he or she did something wrong, they're no longer a strength. So I wouldn't use that either. What are the strengths of your church? What are the weaknesses of your church? And don't say we don't have youth. That doesn't work. But what are really the weaknesses of the church? And then what are the opportunities out there in the community? And what would stop you from walking through those open doors and doing something in the community? So this is a great tool. I highly recommend it. It works really great. All right, here's a couple things for you to consider. Don't you like the way I did that? All right, I just wanted to show you that I have some creativity, very little. Anyway, describe some of the changes that you've noticed in your neighborhood. This is, again, huge. So going back to the church I just retired from, in the last 5 years, we were very much a blue-collar white community. 5 years ago, because New Hampshire has a very low tax base, we don't have income tax and we don't have state sales tax. So the only tax we have is property, and it's pretty low compared to Massachusetts, which is called Taxachusetts. People were selling their houses in Massachusetts for $800,000, $1.2 million, houses that they only paid $30,000 and $40,000 from years ago. And taking all this money that they make, and they come to New Hampshire and pay cash for a house for about $300,000 and $400,000. All of a sudden, we saw Latinos come into our community, and we saw people of color coming into the community. That was a change. And it was so bad that I had a black intern 2 years ago in our church from the seminary that I teach at, and Zach was with us for the summer. And one day, Zach was in my car, my truck, and we were driving downtown, and Gary, one of the cops, stopped me and asked me if I'm doing okay. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. I looked at him, I said, Gary, why are you asking? And I go, oh, you didn't. I'm sorry, Ron. Yeah, well, you just devastated this young man sitting next to me. We weren't used to this migration. But that was our new community that we were now walking into. And so it's really important for us to understand the community that we live in. What has happened in the last 5 years, and what are the implications of that for our congregation? Contextual analysis. Look at your building and property. That's an asset. What do you have? And how can you use it more fully? What are the demographics of your community? That's important too. Mapping your community. In other words, what I mean by that is when I tell my students that when you become the pastor of the church in Georgetown, Massachusetts, or wherever you are, the first thing you need to do is go to a town meeting. I talked about that yesterday, because a town meeting will define for you the DNA of the community. But secondly, you need to study the history of the church, and you need to start interviewing teachers. You need to start interviewing the police department, any organization that you possibly can interview, you need to interview them. So I'll give you an example. When I went to the Bridge, which is the First Baptist Church of Milford, when I got there 13, 14 years ago, I decided the first thing I'm going to do is go downtown and just ask people if they knew where the church was. And you need to understand that my predecessor was a policeman part-time for 25 years. I went downtown and not one person knew where we were. Now you need to understand that our church is right across the street from the high school. Right kitty corner to the middle school. Nobody knew where we were. So I went to 4 policemen, and they didn't even know where we were. Think about that for a second. What does that tell me as the new pastor? We're in trouble as far as visibility. The second thing that I did is I encouraged my leaders to go into the community, and I'm proud to be a Baptist, don't get me wrong. Went into the community and asked people what they thought of the word Baptist. And then one of my 80-year-old men came back to me and said, Pastor, when are we going to change the name of this church? And I go, why? He goes, the name doesn't fit with our community, with what God is telling us to do, and that's to be a community church. So we changed the name. And so I asked him, I said, so what should we call ourselves? He goes, well, he says, you and your wife have this little saying when we start complaining to you, and the little saying is, build a bridge and get over it. And then I also taught them the bridge illustration to share the gospel. He says, so we should call ourselves the Bridge Community Church. I said, well, let's pray about it. Well, Bobby doesn't believe in prayer, I guess, because he spread it through the whole church. By the way, it was a unanimous decision, and we had nobody leave the church over our name change. It was unanimous. Here's the thing. When you do mapping, you begin to understand the DNA of your church. And when you understand the DNA of your church and the history of your church, there are things that you can do that the people will be on the same page. And we had an organ that they hadn't used in 10 years because we can't find pipe organ players anymore. And it was a pipe organ. It was gorgeous. But it would have cost us $80,000 to fix it to get it up to par. And so they looked at me and said, what are we going to do with this? And I go, I don't know. So I talked to an organ company, and they said they had a Catholic church in Marblehead, Massachusetts, that would be willing to pay to dismantle it and move it to their church because it would still be cheaper than getting a new pipe organ. They spent, by the way, over $500,000 moving it, rebuilding it, and putting it in their balcony. And all of a sudden, we had all this space on our stage with the leaky baptistry. It must have been a Presbyterian and put the leak in, I don't know. But anyways, so we took the baptistry out. We built this huge stage that people just absolutely loved because now our worship team was on there. And we were able to do all, as I said, we use our building for a lot of different things. We had a country western dance up in our auditorium. We don't call it sanctuary. We had ballet things. We had all sorts. The high school uses our building all the time for programs, okay? So anyways, but the DNA of our church was if we didn't do something, we would be nothing. And so we made some huge, difficult decisions. By the way, moving the organ was a unanimous decision. It was unanimous. Why? Because we got everybody on the same page. And everybody together in unity decided these are things we needed to do to move forward. All right, mapping the community. So what do we do first? I want to break it down real quickly, and here's what you need to do first, in my opinion. Notice that's in my opinion. All right, first of all, develop chunks of a plan or 1 or 2 goals. Don't do more than 1 or 2 goals, and make sure they stretch you just a little bit, but just come after you do all this assessment, come up with 1 or 2 goals that you feel you can possibly do. Even though it might stretch you a little bit, that's a good thing, because they need to be engaging and compelling. Whatever that means, they need to be engaging and compelling, and they should be doable but challenging. So when you assess what you have, when you assess the community, and you see all your strengths and your gifts and whatever, you need to come to the point where you realize, all right, this is something we think we can do. It's going to stretch us a little bit. It might cost us a little bit more money. It might be uncomfortable for us, but I think we can do this, whatever that is. Notice I don't tell you what to do, because every church is different. So I just finished doing a consulting in our region with a church that's on the lake, and the parsonage overlooks the Lake Winnipesaukee. It's like, wow, this is heaven. This is like heaven. And so the pastor and his wife can actually sit on their porch and overlook the lake. It's like, how can this church not grow? Anyways, so what we did, so they finally said to me after we did all this assessment, so Ron, tell us what we're supposed to do. I said, I can't tell you that. I don't know what God wants for you. Maybe he wants you to have a boat ministry. I don't know. You figure it out. I'm just going to give you the tools. But every church is different, and you need to decide what's doable, but also let it be stretching just a little bit and challenging. Also, make it very specific. Whatever you do, let it be very, very specific. Focus on action that gives life to your mission and your vision. Again, we talked about this yesterday, and that is this. If somebody comes up to you and says, Pastor, I want to have a quilting ministry. I don't get that, by the way, but whatever. Okay? And the first thing I'll say to them is, how does that fit in your mission and vision of the church? Are non-church people going to come? No, probably not. So why do it? I mean, if you like quilting, feel free to do it at home. But why do we want to have a quilting ministry? I mean, I went to that with the firewood ministry. It's like, okay, wait a minute, firewood ministry. I have a Nest thermostat that I can change on my phone anytime I want to. Why would I want a firewood ministry? And then they explained the need in the community, which I was surprised I didn't know about. And I said, fine, if you think it fit in our mission, it fit in our vision. I said, I can't say no to that because it fits with what we want to do, and that is to minister to our community. I said, just go ahead and do it. Good luck. I'll pray for you. I ain't chopping wood, but I'll pray for you. And I told you, it's an amazing ministry right now. It's just amazing. So you never know. So focus on actions that give life to your mission and your vision. And of course, a lot of churches don't have a vision, to be honest. And share them with each interest group and discuss again, because what happens is mission leaks or vision leaks. And so what happens is you have to keep talking and talking about it and talking about it and be excited about it. Because then you own that vision that you came up with as a church. But if you don't talk about it, if it just comes from the head up, head down, I should say, if it just comes from the pastor and the board, then the rest of the congregation is not on board. So when we decided our vision at the church I was at, we had meetings, we had dinners, we had parties. We even went to the parade and threw necklaces, New Orleans necklaces, purple, gold, green necklaces. Mardi Gras, thank you. All right, Sam. I need a young person to tell me. Anyway, and we just threw those in the community, and on each of the necklaces was a little tag with the vision of our church. That we wanted to be a church for them. So after that, I had people go out in the community and say, do you know where the Bridge Community Church is? They knew exactly where we were. Isn't that amazing? Just little things like that. All right, but you also have to find a balance. And I'm going to end with this. I like that picture. I don't know where I got it, but I like it. Okay, be who you are. But also, find the deepest and greatest potential in your church. But you got to be who you are. And secondly, acknowledge your limitations, but live fully within your gifts or your assets. Some churches will come to the point where they're going to say, it's just not going to happen with the people that are left. Okay, so what does that mean? That's a hard decision, isn't it? Well, you could stay the same, like I said, and eventually somebody's going to inherit. You know, one of the sad things is on my way to seminary, every day that I teach, there's this little church that's no longer a church. It's actually a residence. In the town that I live in now, the First Baptist Church of Exeter is selling their building. Now, there's about 30 people left in the church, but they're selling their building for $500,000, and it's turning into condos. And that's sad. But that's what's happening with a lot of our buildings. Now, the one good thing about First Baptist of Exeter is that they're moving into a smaller building, which would be, but there's no vision there. They're basically the older people who are part of that church said, we're just going to move into a smaller building. And because I talked to them, I said, when are you going to, they're still on Zoom. And I was like, why are you on Zoom when in New Hampshire you can do anything you want to do? Oh, we kind of like it. It's kind of nice just being together on Zoom. What does that say? They couldn't give a flip about what happens outside of Zoom or their church. They're more comfortable being the 20 or 30 people that gather together on Zoom. I think they're finally going to meet July 4th in their new little building that they're renting. It's like that church has no future. It just doesn't. And yet, it's sad. I gave them a good interim. I hope that he can help them to see that they're dying, but I doubt it. And then finally, dream boldly. Dream boldly and make it real. Father, thank you for the church because you called us to be the church. Thank you for the men and women who lead our church. Thank you for the history of our churches. But Father, now help us to be creative. Help us to sense your spirit. Help us to hear you, not our own agenda, not our own comfort zones, but help us to hear you and where you want us to go as the Church of Jesus Christ. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay.
All right.